Good morning, everyone. This talk is really an invitation to all of you to think about hearable computing, which I think is a new area that's in the making. And let me start by the takeaway message of the talk. Uh, I think a paradigm shift is on the horizon that will transform today's earphones into what we call hearables. And this shift kind of bears resemblance to how dumb phones transformed to smartphones. Okay? But that's not the most important point. I think more important point is we as a mobile computing community were partly late to the party when it came to smartphones. We kind of followed, we were like supporting actors. In the case of hearables, I think we have an opportunity to shape the area. And I think this time we should not be late. This paper and this talk is an attempt to get your attention. And the way I want to do it is by telling you why I think Hearable is the right thing to do and this is the right time. And then share a bunch of problems, a basket of problems in Hearable computing that I think are reasonably hard, but also doable and very much falls in the kind of research that we do as a community. Okay. So with that takeaway message, let me get started with the presentation. So if you're not following what is happening in the earphone space, I really encourage you to do it. There's lots of very interesting things going on. I wish I had time to say a few things about each, but I'll just say that Apple is bringing in a whole bunch of sensors into their earphones. Facebook has a new lab called Facebook Reality Labs. Amazon has already a um, glasses frames that they've brought in. Samsung has gestures. Nokia has a platform. Google is doing speech translation. Dolby is doing 3D sound, and so on and so forth. I'll mention one cool startup called Neura on the right top corner of the screen. They are basically shining wireless acoustic music signals into your ear canal, looking at the reflections of the signal, understanding the impulse response or the shape of the ear canal, and accordingly equalizing the music so that you hear it in an optimal way, as if the music is customized to your anatomy, to your ear canal's shape. Okay? So this is the kind of sophistication that are coming to earphones, and it's exciting. My point is this is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay? I think already there are a whole bunch of sensors, computing power coming into earphones, microphones, speakers, Bluetooth, IMUs, and there are many more that are on the roadmap. Vibration sensors, in-ear microphones, optical sensors, neural brain sensors, and even arrays of microphones and speakers. And once you have arrays of microphones and speakers, you can do a whole kinds of geometric signal processing, array processing on these devices. Algorithms and primitives are coming in acoustics, speech, multimodal. We already saw two interesting pieces of work before this, right? Um, Wireless embedded systems, machine learning. And I feel it's a matter of time before an app store begins to crop up where there'll be apps for the earphone. And my feeling is these apps would be more exciting than the smartphone apps, and more importantly will be up our alley as a community, because these apps would be around sensing, communication, signal processing, HCI, embedded systems, and so forth. Okay. I would even predict that this is not about whether it'll happen, whether this transition to hearables will happen. I think it's more about when it happens, where will the curve saturate? Meaning, I think if the mobile computing research community really engages, I think the curve can saturate much higher into really a paradigm shift. If we do not do a great job, and if aren't able to come in and do some of the important breakthroughs, then the curve will saturate earlier, and it'll be a great product. It'll be a great accessory to the smartphone, but it may not be a paradigm shift, right? And I think this is where the research community could potentially come in early and shape the trajectory and thereby influence where the curve saturates. Great. So be- while we are talking about the various positive and favorable wishful thinking around hearables, I think we should also be cautious and say, why hearables? Why now? I mean, we've heard a lot of hypes come in and go. Why do you think hearables are really this is the right time to do hearables? And I want to give you three arguments. The first argument is that the, the input output interface between humans and mobile devices thus far have been reading and typing, pretty much, right? You're reading or you're watching YouTube videos, reading articles, or typing as the input and reading is the output. And both reading and writing require a complete cognitive refocus towards that action, right? You, while you're reading or while you're watching a YouTube video, you can't even cross a road, right? However, there are lots of actions that we do with mobile devices that does not require a complete cognitive refocus. Hey, what reading and listening to a podcast, reading an article, where finding something on a map, all these things can be taken away and pushed to the acoustic bandwidth in a way where voice and hearing can make it seamless for humans to interact with devices. So I think voice and hear, this was difficult without speech recognition and NLP in the past. But now that those barriers have been broken, I think this opens up a new modality of communication between humans and computers. And I think that's where hearables become very important because they're close to your ears and mouth and they can whisper back information while it's privacy preserving. The second argument I want to give you is that all the wearable devices that we have seen, like Fitbits, watches, phones, they have mostly been carried by humans in the lower part of the body, right? All of them are at the torso level or below the torso level in your wristwatches, in your pockets, etc. I think hearables is the first kind of device which is on the upper part of your body, especially the head. And I think there's a lot of information going around the head. You're talking, you're listening, you're eating, you're looking, you're thinking. This amount of entropy, this amount of information on the top of your head, there's no device that taps into them better than earphones. And I think earphones is in a great vantage point to actually understand much more information about what the human is doing. And if Fitbit created this quantified self revolution, I think earphones or hearables have a much better shot at making it or at enriching it. My final argument is that earphones are already socially accepted. People are wearing earphones for many hours of the day. If you go into a university campus, almost everyone's wearing earphones at least while they're walking around. And as a result, it's like it's already socially accepted. This is very different from Google Glass, where there was a big challenge of whether people will adopt such a device or not. But I think earphones have already been socially accepted, have been adopted. So really, we have the opportunity to just upgrade the backend, meaning the software and the hardware and the cloud and etc. And the social aspects of it, the adoption aspects of it, the risks are much lower. And I think this is an important risk taken away, which is a strong motivation to do research and really change what I think is the back end, the research aspects of hearable computing. Of course, there are hurdles. It's not as rosy. Energy is a big problem, right? We have to be very energy aware. Discomfort is an issue. If we want hearable computing to be like a smartphone, discomfort is really going to be a pain because you don't want to block your ears for 24 hours or even for 12, 14 hours. It has been talked about that if you block air circulation into your ear, infections can develop. It's not good for your ear health. Privacy is an issue. A lot of people tell me that they don't want to speak loudly. In fact, the Jawsense work was also talking about that. Radiation is also a concern. Google Glass, I remember, was trying to radiate all the wireless signals away from the head by doing all kinds of beamforming. So there are definitely issues and concerns, but I think they are not insurmountable. And I think that's where we need to come in and make leaps. Okay. So this paper is essentially calling the mobile computing community to think about this problem space. And what I want to do today is to share a few research problems just to whet your appetite, just to get your attention. And this is clearly not a good sampling of the problem space. This is just a sampling that I find interesting. And from my limited expertise and limited background, there are many other problems that I'm not covering in this talk. Okay? But here is a basket of problems that I want to talk about. And I'll do them very quickly just to give you a flavor of the problems. My goal is for you to kind of go back and think about, hey, is this something to look at? Okay. So the problems look like whisper decoding, 3D sound, open ear acoustics, motion, location, gesture tracking, health monitoring, beamforming, security, edge computing, etc. And let me just dive in, okay? With whisper decoding. Again, I'll talk about each problem in 1 or 2 slides and move on. So this is a rapid fire. Great. So whisper decoder, okay? So consider a noisy public space. I think Josens was talking about that just before me. In this kind of a scenario, given a person is shy and does not want to speak very loudly because other people will hear Alice talking to her earphone, talking to Alexa on her earphone or Siri, she's going to whisper. As a result, the sound that the earphone is going to hear, the voice commands, is going to be very low SNR. Right? And we know that speech recognition at very low SNR is very difficult. Okay? So now there is an IMU on the earphone. The IMU actually touches certain parts of the ear where actually you can pick up signals. The last talk was talking about it. And here is an example on the right side of 2 signals, one coming from the microphone and one coming from the IMU. Now there are trade-offs here. What's the trade-off? The microphone signal is full bandwidth, 20 kilohertz, right? It's much better quality signal that's coming over the air, but it's heavily affected by all the ambient noise in the environment. On the other hand, the IMU signal, which is essentially vibrations that come from your throat through your jaw and your skin to your IMU, it's a much low bandwidth signal, 500 hertz, much less bandwidth. It's aliased and it's distorted. And this channel is a very nonlinear channel that we do not know how to handle. But the good side of it is the IMU signal is not affected by any of the ambient interference, because if a train goes by, the air vibrations are not strong enough to make the IMU vibrate. So now you have 2 different modalities, and you can ask the question, can I decode human speech by combining the microphone signal and the IMU signal? Given that both of these things have different pros and cons, how do you combine the two? And the success metric should be the combined signal, your V hat T, which is what you've decoded from both the microphone and IMU, should pass the ASR test, which is the automatic speech recognition test. Okay? And I think this is a problem that has not been looked at, and I think it's not an easy problem. And yet, if you can do it, imagine your IMU is always on, and whenever it hears, "Hi, Alexa," it turns on the rest of the microphone. That actually makes a big difference in energy consumption and also in low SNR speech recognition. Next problem, okay? Completely different setting, right? I'm changing gears. Imagine a scenario where you're in an airport and there are lots of sounds that come to you from the ambience, right? There's an overhead announcement happening from the ceiling. There's a crowded food court. There is a TV news that's going on from your right side, and your brain actually can figure out where these noises are coming from. I don't know if you've wondered, how does your brain exactly figure out the directions of these noise? And here is the high-level idea. At a very high level, your brain can figure out the time difference of arrival of a sound at your 2 ears. So if a sound comes from the front, the 2 sounds arrive with 0 difference. But if a sound arrives from your right, that sound arrives at your right ear first and then your left ear. And this delta difference is something that your brain can process. But actually, this is a very oversimplification. In reality, your pinna, which is your ear, actually creates lots of micro echoes of the sound, and your cheekbones and your face, they actually diffract the sound in certain ways to help your brain precisely figure out where the sound is coming from and how far the sound is. If you just use time difference of arrival, that is not enough to disambiguate the angle of the sound. So the question is, can we really understand what your head is doing to a sound that impinges on it? And not only that, every head is different, every shape of the ear is different. So can you really understand the personal filter that your head is? This is called a head-related transfer function, and it's a personal transfer function. And here are experiments that have been done where a lot of speakers have been placed from different angles, and simulations have been done which understands how the signals propagate, they diffract, they reflect, etc., and the filter response of your head. This is a very difficult problem, right? You need a lot of an acoustically treated room, an anechoic chamber, speakers, you need to sit still, speakers need to move. It's very cumbersome to figure out what your personalized head-related transfer function is. And on top of that, if your head is moving, you do not want the sound space to be changing with your head. So therefore, you need to compensate for your head motion. Why am I saying this? Imagine we can figure out what every individual's personalized HRTF looks like. Then what we can do is we can take a sound, treat it with the personalized HRTF and play it through our earphones, and our brain would be tricked into believing that the sound is coming from some direction. So imagine a person who's in the airport and you play a sound, suppose the person wants to go to Starbucks. And the person says, "Hey Siri, take me to Starbucks." Siri could play this directional sound in the earphone which says, "Follow me." And the person would hear the sound coming from northwest. And the person just needs to follow that voice and she would be at Starbucks, right? So you can do acoustic augmented reality, you can do VR, you can do immersive meetings and whole all bunch of stuff once you know the personalized head-related transfer function. I think that is a research challenge which is difficult but heavily impactful. Switching gears, next problem, motion, location, and gesture tracking. This community knows a lot about using IMUs to do pedestrian dead reckoning, meaning understanding the trajectory in which a user is walking, which essentially boils down to step count, step length, and walking direction. If you know these three unknowns, you can solve it. And people have tried to get these three unknowns, step count, step length, and step and walking direction, from smartwatch or smartphone IMU data. And we know this IMU data from watches and phones are very noisy, right? But if you look at the IMU data from the earphones, naturally, it's much, much cleaner. Why? And this is where I think it gets interesting. We've done some study and it turns out that the human body, the skeleton, is actually a low pass filter. It eliminates all the high frequency vibrations that happens in your watches and your phones. For example, when your feet hits the floor, there are all kinds of vibrations that are happening, but those vibrations don't travel through your skeleton all the way to your head. The vibrations get filtered out by your ball and socket joints and by your tissues and muscles. One can ask, why is the skeleton a low pass filter? And one of the reasons is your eye muscles, if it was not a low pass filter, your eye muscles would vibrate, your eye would vibrate, and your eye would always have to refocus on what you're seeing. But because your skeleton is eliminating the high frequency vibrations, your eye muscles don't have to constantly contract and expand to refocus. The skeleton does this, or maybe evolution has done this. So now if you put an earphone on your head, you naturally gain from that benefit. And it is much more possible to actually do pedestrian dead reckoning much better with earphones. Okay? So there are opportunities of these motion tracking gesture recognition with such kind of IMU sensors on the earphones. The question is, what other motion tracking, or even can you do localization using your earphone IMU, maybe combined with your smartphone and maybe motion models of the skeleton. Next problem. We're not going to wear earphones 12 hours of the day that will block our ears, right? So you have to think about earphones that are open ear. But once you make it open ear, all kinds of problems come in. For example, noise cancellation is something that's very difficult to do if you keep your ear open. Not only that, if you have these glasses where you have speakers, if you send signals from those speakers, the quality of the sound is not good. Even with bone conduction speakers are speakers which touch your skull and vibrate the skull. And that skull vibration actually goes into your cochlea, and you can actually hear the sound from the skull vibrations. Okay. So that quality of the sound is also not great, primarily because these sounds from the speaker or the bone conduction speakers, they do not really know the channel from the speaker to your cochlea. There is no microphone inside your cochlea which will give feedback to figure out the channel, right? But this can be thought of as a gradient descent problem with user feedback. Meaning, suppose you change the sound signal and ask the user, hey, how is this going? How do you feel the sound is? And suppose the user gives you a score, right? You can now do gradient descent on this until you estimate the channel. And once you've estimated the channel, you can pre-code the sound such that once the sound arrives at your ear, the channel's effect has been canceled and the user will hear the precise sound. The problem is this user feedback is too painful, burdensome, right? The user is not going to give you feedback for such a high dimensional space. You have to do gradient descent in a very high dimensional space. So this leads to a question, can you do gradient descent on a budget? Meaning, I will tell you that you can do, every time you do a measurement, which is basically measuring the gradient, you have a cost. And then I tell you, you have a budget. How close can you get to the optimal if you actually operate on that budget, where every time you measure the gradient, you actually expend your budget? How close can we get to the optimal? Okay. I think this is a research problem that has not been looked at, and I think it can be interesting and very much falls in our community. Finally, beamforming in cocktail party. We want to talk to other people. Hearing aids are often wanting to do this, where someone wants to talk to you. You want to amplify that sound and dim out all the other background. This is essentially a question of beamforming or angle of arrival detection from only two microphones, which is a very hard problem. And not only that, when the signals arrive at your head, they diffract, like we talked about in transfer functions. And beamforming algorithms have all been developed with linear microphones or circular microphones, not with heads. And with diffraction and all these transfer functions, I think array processing algorithms need to be updated. That literature is quite open, quite unexplored, and I think we need to look at that. There are lots of other problems. Two-factor authentication is a problem. A lot of people in developing regions only have a smartphone. And if they do two-factor authentication, the password or the one-time PIN number comes to the smartphone. So someone steals the smartphone, everything is gone. Can you use earphones as a second device for two-factor authentication with smartphones? I think this is a problem we can easily solve. Fingerprinting the ear canal is something we can do for continuous authentication. Facial motion expression, can you detect mood of a person by understanding facial motions? Can you do edge computing? Can you push certain things to the smartphone or even to your Wi-Fi access point? Maybe you want to develop a standalone earphone that when you go out for jogging, you don't have to carry your phone anymore. I think there are lots of problems over here. Okay? So assorted closing thoughts. I think acoustics, not I think it's a fact. Acoustics is the only bandwidth in which humans can both produce and consume wideband information. If you think of vision, we are consuming a lot of information, but we are not producing any. We don't produce light, right? We don't produce halo from our body. We only consume, right? Taste, smell, maybe we produce and consume, but it's only a very little bit of information, 1, 2 bits, right? Even touch. But hearing, we have 20 kilohertz of information that we are producing and consuming. And I think with breakthroughs in NLP and speech, this is a new channel that can be very exciting, right? And especially when acoustics come with geometry, meaning we can understand directions with a sound, it actually closes the gap between vision and acoustic and spatial. So, in other words, I'm not proposing that we should get away with screens. We definitely need screens because the visual bandwidth is much bigger than the acoustic bandwidth. But I think the gap between visual and acoustic can be narrowed down once we use geometry of acoustics intelligently. And that gap between visual and spatial acoustics is actually narrower than one would think. I have quite a bit of thought around this. So chat with me if you want to think about this more. Number two, I think this area of hearable computing is very much up our alley. It satisfies some of the constraints that we want as a research community, such as there's a nice balance of analytical and systems problems in mobile, sensing, DSP, OS, embedded systems, which is where we operate. There are platforms already available. We typically want platforms on which we can do experiments. There are already available platforms. Nokia, Fahim's group from Nokia already gives out these platforms. Tam Wu is someone who's building his own hardware platform. It's actually very exciting. So these platforms are already there for us for our research. And there's a rich space for human-centric applications, which is also something we as a community are interested in. And hearable computing really sits in the middle. Last point I want to say is there's lots of problems I've not talked about because I do not know much about them. Hardware, computer architecture, right? What sensors should we use? What processors? Healthcare applications. TAM is already doing blood pressure sensing, EMG. Embedded AI, I think Samsung is looking at onboard speech recognition, user interface, networking, brain-human interfaces, glasses, hearing aids, gesture recognition. Finally, I want to say that there's a lot of people I've been talking to, and I've had a lot of thoughtful conversations with them. A shout out to my students, Jijian, Wally, Liz, Jay, Sheng, and to Haitham, my colleague, and many other people with whom I've been talking about these things. Uh, our website has much more information. Please feel free to visit. Uh, it's a Hearable Computing webpage. And lastly, let me just say, I think this is an invitation for everyone to kind of spare a few cycles thinking about hearable computing. I think there's a lot out there, and once you start thinking, I feel many doors will open up. Okay. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take questions and comments.